Speaker, can you explain Chinese's influence in the elections in Hong Kong? What are they actually doing that's objectionable?
And are you supporting the students?
The basic question, as I understand it, is what's happening in Hong Kong, what's it about, and from Eric, am I supporting the students? I'm not supporting the students. The movement in Hong Kong, in my opinion, is a movement which is fundamentally a reactionary movement, seeking to establish a parliamentary democracy in the whole of China. And it's using Hong Kong as the lever in which to do that, to try and promote the idea of what they're now calling an umbrella. It's always got to have some name. Used to be colour revolution, now they want an umbrella revolution, in which the demand for one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, plus freedom to choose political parties or individuals in Hong Kong is being used as a means of promoting the idea of the same policies throughout the whole of China. And so I think you have to conceptualize it on a national scale for the whole of China, rather than look at the specifics of Hong Kong on its own.
Well, no, because the deal that was made with Pat was that there would be democratic elections.
Well,
That's the deal.
Well, the deal that was made with Patton was pretty much the deal that they've got. But obviously, Beijing would determine the final outcome of what would happen. And so the argument, firstly, let me give you an example of the way in which this has been presented here. I watched the BBC report a couple of days ago about the demonstrations. Actually, there were some fights broke out in an area called Mong Kok in Kowloon, I think it is. And the fights between residents and what were called on the BBC triads, without any evidence, but they called them triads. And then the BBC reporter went to the students or the protesters and said, what do you think? And then they said, yeah, these are triads and troublemakers, and we're going to fight on. And then they went really like that. And the BBC reporter joined in the cheers. Now, the BBC there is a law in Britain about objectivity in the press. And you're supposed to, I don't agree with that law, but you're supposed to only really broadcast about a controversial issue like that, where you have both sides of the argument being put. And actually they went over to the other side and basically just presented them like lunatics, and certainly didn't cheer them when they said what they said. Now, the British, from the time of the Opium War, when they managed to force China to concede Hong Kong to the British, never granted the right to vote to the people of Hong Kong. The right to vote to the people of Hong Kong was granted as a part of a deal after the handover of power from the British. So the British had no policy of supporting democracy in Hong Kong for more than 100 years, when it was under direct British colonial domination. Now all of a sudden the BBC and the British government and the British establishment are proclaiming how much they're in favour of democracy in Hong Kong, because they see it as a leverage to try to overthrow the government in Beijing. That's what it's about. So you have to conceptualise things in a total scale rather than view it on a specific local scale. What do you say?
I said your view is absolutely right.
So I think you have to conceptualise the total framework within which the situation is operating. Now, some people were discussing this on the internet this week, and I said, well, if you want to fight, there were some left-wingers who said they were supporting the movement, and I said, well, if you want to fight for the rights of the people in Hong Kong, there's a very simple way you could do that, for example, and that is, in 2011, there was a law passed in Shanghai municipality, which granted the workers of all workplaces the right to elect their managers, whether in private or public or cooperative enterprises. Now, it's true that generally is not actually what happens, but it is the law in the People's Republic of China in Shanghai municipality. In fact, it's the law nationally, but it's more specific in Shanghai. Now, these people are not demanding rights for the workers, they're demanding what they call a capitalist democracy, like the Western European countries or the United States of America. That's the basic demand that is being made, and that they should determine the legislation. Now, in terms of their actual technical question. Is that a democratic election? Well, I agree. It's not a democratic election in the Western democratic sense. It's not. I agree with that. Hong Kong is not a normal city in the Western sense. The deal was made specifically between Beijing and Britain over the handover to make it peaceful and so on, that they would leave the system pretty much as it is, in other words, leave it as a capitalist-dominated system, and maintain various freedoms and rights that do not exist in China inside Hong Kong. The freedom of speech, the freedom to demonstrate and so on. A big hoo-ha was made about last week when demonstrators came down to central and other parts of central Hong Kong and protested. A big hoo-ha was made of the fact that tear gas was used. Now, I've been on demonstrations in Berlin and in London. Okay, not tear gas in London, but certainly kettling as the immediate reaction of the government in London. You'll get kettled. You go down Oxford Street and demonstrate, there'll be a kettle stirred around you within 20 minutes, and the police will hold you there for hours and hours and hours until you are starved into submission. Basically, you need to go to the toilet, you can't go. You need to get a drink, you can't get one. And then the police will gradually let the people slowly dissipate away out of the area. Now, the fact of the matter is, the Hong Kong government were quite mild in the way they treated the demonstrations. Not only that, but after the first protest, they withdrew the police almost completely. And now you had the absurd situation yesterday where the demonstrators were shouting at people saying to the police, you must arrest them, you must arrest them, you must arrest them. So, in actual fact, the Hong Kong police and the Hong Kong state have been quite mild in the way they reacted towards the demonstrations. If you compare it, for example, to Britain or Germany or the United States of America. In Ferguson,
Square,
for example, they shot people down. Sorry, Tiananmen Square?
Yeah.
Or Tiananmen Square, that's also true. That's also true. Having said that, you must remember Tiananmen Square went on quite a long time. It started in February, March.
It's been going on a long time. And,
This has been going on for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, but I would say, it looks as if, Monday, force will be used to disperse them.
Well, I listened to the radio on my way here this afternoon. And will force be used to disperse them? Well, on the radio they said this morning that as the evening drew to a close in Hong Kong, there were 300 demonstrators. Now, 300 demonstrators is not a very large number of people. It doesn't require a lot of force to clear them away. Yeah? So they can simply encircle them like they would do in Oxford Street or in Trafalgar Square, or I've been on them even in Trafalgar Square. You get locked in. So I doubt very much that this is going to go on much longer, because one, even though the students have a significant amount of support amongst themselves, there are different forces all squabbling with each other. The Occupy Central movement, which is getting a lot of publicity out of the protest movement, led by a guy named Benny Tai, and the movement itself has been organised and supported by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically a code word for the CIA and the State Department. They're behind basically organising this thing called Occupy Central, which is a prime mover in the whole of the campaign at the moment. And so you have to understand what the overall context is to understand the specific realities of what's happening. Why is the BBC and why are the Western press emphasising this demonstration so much? Is because really their big hope, ultimately, is that there will be some sort of what they call a revolution, a counter-revolution I would call it, across the whole of China, where demonstrations like this would take place in every city, and then the government would fall. Then, of course, when China would break up into different parts and conflicts would break out between different regions of China and different leaders in China, then, of course, they could say, the West has conquered and we've succeeded in dominating the world again and re-establishing, supreme US domination of the world, and there would be no challenges to that. So ultimately that's, and I think there's an awareness of this. The majority of Hong Kong people have not spoken. It's only, the demonstrations are reasonably small in compared with the total population of Hong Kong. The biggest demonstration was estimated to be about 200,000, the biggest demonstration. Most of the demonstrations have been in what they call the thousands or tens of thousands. And there are around 7.2 million population in Hong Kong. So it's certainly not the majority. It's a very small place. It's a very intense small place. It's like West Berlin used to be, a very enclosed location, high density of population, right in central locations. And so the idea that this is expressing the will of the overwhelming majority of the population of Hong Kong, I think is wrong. So that's roughly my perspective on the specifics of the movement in Hong Kong. Yeah, so.
Could you briefly say why they're demonstrating? I didn't know.
They're demonstrating because rather than having independent candidates or political parties selected by whoever, by the population or by individuals standing themselves, Beijing is basically saying that these organisations, or this organisation, like a committee of the sort of government, will choose what candidates will be available to vote, which of course is a stitch-up. I'm not denying it's a stitch-up.
But currently they have free elections there then.
Really have free elections. Again, the powers that are available to the population to decide things are controlled or limited by restrictions imposed by the agreement that they made with the British.
Yeah.
But I mean, for example, I know one guy, he's a legislative councillor, he was elected. He used to be a Trotskyist. He's elected. He's one of the people involved in the movement at the moment. Long hair, they call him. Leung Kok Hong, I think his name is. But he was elected by the local population, received a significant vote. He's a member of the Legislative Council, so he's in the government. But it's not democratic in the same sense as Western democracy. But then again, Western democracy is also not democratic. Here we have political parties that are well established with large amounts of money backing them up, and to stand against them, for example, for an independent person outside the political mainstream or outside the parameters of that political mainstream, to stand in an election in London and win is almost impossible. It doesn't mean you couldn't. In some places it's happened before, but it's almost impossible. And so an existing structure with a long historical background will generally produce the results within one or two variants that governments or establishments inside advanced capitalist democracies want. And so, although formally, which is perfectly correct, Hong Kong doesn't have a democracy in the same sense as Britain does, or so on, actually, democracy is all about the interplay of social forces. And if people are able to demonstrate this type of way, then it reveals a certain healthy democratic atmosphere within society. But like I say, Hong Kong is still not a so-called genuine democracy, and China certainly isn't either. But even though you can have correct demands or even legitimate demands on certain issues, doesn't mean that the movement itself is not seeking something else. I mean, I remember someone asked me about this. What about 1989? You mentioned Tiananmen Square. In 89, in Beijing and in East Germany, and I participated in what happened in East Germany. I was in Beijing when Tiananmen Square happened. When people took to the streets and demanded change, I supported the demands that people had for change at that time. Looking back historically at what happened 25 years ago, I would have to say that now, I would say, those movements had a character which was to seek to overthrow the planned economy and so-called communist governments. That was really what was behind the whole thing. Even though it appeared that people were demanding something else. They were demanding democracy, the right to speak, the right to travel, and so on and so forth, which were perfectly legitimate demands. And so there are times when the specific circumstances in which something happens determine the character of that movement. And of course, in many countries, let's say you're a multi-billionaire and you want to gain authority and prestige in society. Take the case of Poroshenko in Ukraine. Well, when the social movement developed protesting against the corrupt government of Yanukovych, then Poroshenko, the chocolate factory billionaire, is able to utilize his position and his finance and his backers to play on a specific mood within the population, to oust the previous government using a campaign of dirty tricks backed by the Americans, and then engage in a conflict in society which breaks up the country and ends up in a civil war. That doesn't mean that the demands at the beginning weren't legitimate. They were legitimate. So this is the dynamic of conflict, isn't it? Sometimes the banners under which people fight might appear to be justified. For example, another example, the case of the Islamic State. Now, there's no doubt about it. We're dealing with a barbaric politico-military ideological force in Iraq and Syria at the moment, the Islamic State. No doubt about it. That is extreme barbarism. That has been used, that fact has been used to justify British, Danish, French, American bombs being dropped on the people of Iraq and Syria. So I don't believe that that is justified. But the issue they've picked on is a perfectly justifiable issue. In fact, it's the same in a way with...
Why it does happen like that?
Sorry?
Why it does happen in some country like this? Like some happen like unusual things, and some country it does not happen, but in some country it does happen like unusual thing. You don't think so? That is
I think
true?
unusual
Or
things
how
happen.
you know that? Why it does happen? What is the cause of that does happen like this? Yeah. Who allow them to happen? Yeah. First of all, we have to think about the allowing.
I think
first
you-
to that's happen. Like when it is a child born, yeah. If it is happen to a child some things, we have to think about that things, yeah. Not when it is big, 20 or 30 years old. Then we think about the child. Now he is a child. We have to think about that. Yeah, that's wrong.
I think there are some circumstances where geopolitical forces are at play. There are other circumstances where internal forces are at play which unleash a certain process of transformation, a sudden explosion of social, political, military discontent. And that occasions only sometimes in history. That's why we see, for example, in Syria this event happening, a specific correlation of forces connected internally and externally fosters this movement, which, you know, as I said last week, the war against the Islamic State, from the point of view of the British, is kind of farcical, because who are we fighting? We are fighting against, you know, they're talking about Andy McNabb this morning. I read in the news, former SAS agent. He said it's very difficult now for us to go in and capture Jihadi John. And Jihadi John, everybody knows, is a Brit. He's British. So in other words, a British man chops off the head of a British man in Syria or in Iraq, and then we go and bomb Syria and Iraq. But I mean, the Syrians and Iraqis are hardly responsible for Jihadi John. He's a product of British society. Very much, you can hear in his accent. In fact, there was a guy here last week. He said the guy knows him and he's a rapper. I don't know if he's a rapper. I don't know if he knows him. But in any case, we had another guy here. Remember years ago, this guy used to stand on my platform here that they're accused of being a terrorist or inciting terrorism. Mohammed Hamid, Osama bin Laden, they used to call him. Well, it's a laugh, but they put him in prison for 7 years. I don't know whether he was guilty of any crime, but 7 years in prison for what they alleged that he did, and that is go on a training mission, basically shooting paintballs paid by the BBC. I think that's not legitimate grounds for putting someone in prison if the BBC set you up.
How do we deal with ISIS then if we don't bomb them?
How do you deal with ISIS? Well, I think you have to deal with the internal question here. You see, many times I try to point out, and I had a bit of controversy last week when I posted some of the discussion about Scotland, and some people were sort of angry, saying, but British imperialism is, there would be two imperialism if you got Scotland and England separated, and it doesn't make any difference. It's better to have a united country. I took the position it would be better for Scotland to break away, because it would undermine British imperialism. And here we have the case. We're discussing global affairs, whether it be Hong Kong and the relationship between the demonstrations in Hong Kong and the fate of China. There you see that the hand of Britain was behind it, because the British, from the time of the Opium War, where they forced the Chinese to take their opium, to 1997, they controlled and dominated Hong Kong and used it as a colony with no democratic rights at all. In fact, the Hong Kong police, when people used to protest in Hong Kong under British rule, until 1997, that's not so long ago, until 1997, the British maintained Hong Kong as a dictatorship. A dictatorship. And so when they turn around and say, oh, the Chinese aren't giving rights to the Hong Kong people, you might have a look at your own past. The country or the city was seized by the British by war, was a method to impose the sale of opium on the whole of China, and then was maintained as a dictatorship until 1997. And then the BBC complains, oh my God, the people in Hong Kong don't have any rights.
No, but because Britain behaved badly in the past, surely does not mean that any country, China for example, can behave badly today or in the future.
Well,
I
the
mean, that
issue
is
is-
an argument that just has no sense to it.
Well, that isn't what I argued.
Yes, it is.
It's not what I argued. That's what you've extrapolated from my argument.
Up to 1997. Therefore, you can't complain about China being dictators now.
Well, I
It's a
didn't say that.
ridiculous
I did not say that. What I said was that the British had a dictatorship until 1997. The British are now, particularly the BBC, supposedly centre of global objectivity in the press. The BBC is effluent with how marvellous the protests are in Hong Kong. If you read and compare the BBC news, it's basically Beijing is threatening a bloodbath and Britain is supporting the rights of the Hong Kong students. That's what you've got from the press. That's what I'm talking about.
That's fair enough.
Now, it's not fair
Yes,
enough.
it is.
As I was pointing out,
That is fair enough.
the issue I was
Can't say
talking
it's
about...
not fair because Britain behaved badly in the past. We're living today.
Well,
We're looking
well,
forward.
But
We're not
last
looking
week,
backwards.
2 weeks ago, Gordon Brown came on television. He made a big speech and he said, alongside David Cameron and Nick Clegg and co, made a big speech. He said, Britain is the country that united, and when it united, the union of the people was a pioneer of uniting the people around the world. What I'm arguing is, Britain is the opposite of that. Britain is the pioneer of dividing people around the world, the pioneer of bombing people around the world, the pioneer of imprisoning people around the world, the pioneer of torturing people around the world. And that is why I mentioned the two areas, Hong Kong, the example can be traced, I said, back to British rule.
Well, let's be
Second point I was
Should
going to
there be
make.
a
One sec.
democracy in Hong Kong?
One sec.
Let's be clear.
The second point.
Should there be a democracy in Hong Kong?
Let me answer you with the first thing I was going to say first, then I'll come back to that. The second point was the issue about the war in Syria, because that's what they did. As soon as they said, we're a uniter of countries, and they managed to twist the arm of the Scots to vote against independence, then the next thing they did in Parliament was they declared de facto English independence from Scotland. That's what they did when David Cameron stood up at the Tory party conference and he said, English votes for English people. In other words, England will decide the entire budgetary expenditure of the whole of Britain. And therefore the Scots will be screwed by the English without having had any referendum on it. In other words, the Scottish independence referendum resulted in a de facto UDI
We're not
by
discussing
England
Scotland, we're
against the
discussing
Scots.
Hong Kong.
That's what happened.
You
Now,
keep
the second thing they did,
prevaricating.
what they did after
Answer
that,
the
I'm coming back to
question.
you. I'm
Answer
coming
the
back to it.
question.
I'm coming back to it. So, then, a few days later, they declared in the British Parliament, 540 votes to 40, that we will go and bomb Iraq and Syria. 540 votes to 40. Now, isn't that a direct reflection of British imperialism, dropping bombs on Iraq and Syria? They've been doing it, don't forget, since 2003. That's 11 years in a row we've been bombing Syria, been bombing Iraq. Last year, we wanted to bomb Syria in favour of the forces who we're now fighting this year. Last year, we wanted to overthrow the government of Syria in the name of fighting against chemical weapons. And who are our allies last year? The same people we are now saying are our enemy. 1 year on, completely the opposite side.
Well, that's 'cause they've
And
changed.
Malcolm
That's
Rifkin,
because they've changed.
who's changed?
The people in
They are the same
this
people.
particular
They are the
poisonous-
same people.
This particular
They are
poisonous
exactly the
strain
same
of
people.
Islam.
Huh?
This particular poisonous strain of Islam.
This
I
particular
don't say
poisonous
Islam
strain
in
of
general.
Islam.
I say this particular
Okay.
poisonous strain.
This particular
They have
poisonous
changed.
strain
They
of
will be
Islam,
allied
where
with
does it come from?
anybody. They will
Where
be
does it come
allies
from?
with anybody who
My
can
friend,
further their
my friend.
cause. And when
Before I
they've
come back-
taken that as far as they can, they will turn on the very people that have been helping them.
Where does this particular
Alliances change.
Where does this
Alliances
particular
change all the time.
brand of Islam come from?
You don't have to have the same.
Where does it come from?
You don't have to have.
Who promotes
You
it?
don't have to have the same aims. Allies have
Saudi
different aims.
Arabia,
Take, for example,
Saudi
Russia and
Arabia
America.
is the
During the
main
last war,
centre for the
they
promotion
were
of
allies, but they
Wahhabism,
had a completely
which led
different
to
philosophy than the way the world should
the
be.
development of Al Qaeda and the
So
development of the
question,
IS, the
should
Islamic
Hong
State.
Kong be
I'm coming back to that.
Oh, you keep coming
I'm coming back to that.
When everybody He's forgotten it.
when we understand the context in which we're talking. Now, Wahhabism is directly funded and supported by Saudi Arabia. They supported bin Laden. Bin Laden's from one of their multi-billionaire families. You go to Saudi Arabia, everywhere you go, they've got bin Laden written on the wall, right? Bin Laden Company. It's a major construction company. Billionaire family, that's what it is. The Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, who have always been supported by the British and the Americans, right? They finance, organize, and support both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And actually there's talk even of Israel supporting the Islamic State.
Sitting on the fence.
Now,
It's called
Now.
making sure you back the winner.
now, backing the winner, I ask you
Give
this.
to both.
What has
So they can't
actually
lose.
galvanised the British population and the British Parliament into supporting dropping bombs on Syria and Iraq? It is not. It's public opinion on the one. It's a public opinion about what? It's because someone's heads are being chopped off. That's why heads are being chopped off. Because this guy, let's assume he comes from South London.
Have you forgotten Hong
Some
Kong?
guy from South London.
Have you forgotten Hong Kong?
I'm coming back
How
to
are you
that.
coming back
I'm
to
coming
that?
back to that.
I hope you can wait.
Some guy from South London chops the head off an American in Iraq after going out there, galvanized to support this movement by a huge financial campaign from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia have supported, don't forget this, between 1945 and 1991, the Soviet Union was accused of being the main enemy in the world. They funded communist parties and political activities around the world, which were supposedly against the West. But what they funded, external to the Soviet Union, to promote their ideas and their movements around the world, is less than the Saudi Arabians have supported in funding for the Wahhabis, Al-Qaeda and IS today. Around 2 billion, I believe it is, a year the Saudis provide to these terrorist forces around the world. And Britain and America support the Saudis.
But they're not killing
Now,
people, yeah?
what do you mean they're not
We
killing
have to
people?
Think about people who
What do you mean
go
they're not
forth
killing people?
and killing people.
They are
And
killing people.
Like people in Iraq and Afghanistan.
But they are killing people.
Like Taliban.
They
We
are
have to
killing
think
people.
about these people. And police going and arrest these people.
They are
They're
killing people.
And
The problem
doing
is,
that.
as I said,
Huh?
we are now going to
We're
war.
not thinking about killing people. How many people is killed every day
We are-
in
we
any
are
country?
talking about that,
We have to
madam. We are
forget
talking
these
about that.
things, yeah? It's not
There are
important.
said to be-
Someone is Christian, someone is
Well,
Muslim. It's their own religion, yeah?
I better say, 1 month ago, it was claimed that there were 5,000 troops, 5,000 soldiers of the Islamic State, as it is now, Islamic State, 5,000 soldiers, of whom 500 are supposed to be from Britain. 500 from Britain. A tenth of the army is from Britain. Now, evidently, the problem is not really a problem in Iraq or in Syria, apart from the fact that we stirred up a cauldron of discontent. The problem actually lies here in Britain. Here in Britain. And that is why the gentleman, he's gone away, but he was upset. But that is why I'm talking about the historical genesis of what happened.
The reason I'm
If
going
you
is
do
that you
not
won't
understand-
answer
I'm
the
coming on to that
question.
now. I'm
No,
coming
you
on to
won't
it. Right
answer.
this minute.
What's
Right
wrong
this
with
minute.
it then?
The historical genesis of what happens. Once you understand the historical genesis, you're in a position to locate what's happening within a general process of change. So, coming on to Hong Kong. This is all in 3 weeks. Scotland, Islamic State, now Hong Kong. Coming to Hong Kong. To understand the genesis of what happened is to understand the dynamics of what is happening. What is happening in Hong Kong, or was an attempt, I believe it's pretty much over now, but anyway, what has been happening in Hong Kong was an attempt by the United States organising through something called Occupy Central, which they've been supporting for a number of years, and the leader of that group called Benny Tai, has been on television quite a lot, a rich guy backed by the Americans, through the National Endowment for Democracy, which basically is a CIA and State Department sponsored organisation. They've been trying to manipulate the students into a protest movement designed to overthrow the Chinese government. That's the game. By overthrowing the Chinese government, the American hopes that they will prevent China from overtaking the United States as the world's dominant economic power, which is happening as we speak. Yeah? Sorry? Well, and the democracy demands are actually based around that.
Every argument to meet your Marxist philosophy of life.
I'll give you what
You're
I
just
think.
missing the point.
You tell me what's
You're
the case.
missing the point.
You counter
I
my
ask you a
argument.
straightforward, simple question.
What?
Do you support democracy in Hong Kong?
I support-
Free and
I
fair
support-
elections.
I
We
support-
don't need a long, rambling answer on what the CIA
You obviously
may or
do.
may not be
You
doing.
obviously do.
You may be right, you may be wrong. It's the
I'll
CIA.
answer you directly.
We don't know.
I'll answer
They're
you directly.
secretive.
I'll answer you directly.
Answer me.
Do I support democracy? Yes. Do I support democracy in Hong Kong? Yes. Do I support democracy in Britain? Yes. But if people vote for the Tory party, I protest against it. Right? Now, I disagree with the Tory party. If the Tory party is elected, I give an explanation. How they got elected, why they got elected, and why we must oppose them. Right? So, if it happens, that's what democracy is. It's not just about do I cross a piece of paper, it's about what else I do. I happen, if you look on the adverts or the promotion, the propaganda campaigns in the First World War, or better said, in the Second World War, you'll see in America and in Britain, they put posters out, they said, why we fight. And they said, and you'll see a picture of someone standing on a platform speaking. Why we fight? Because we believe you have the right to say what you think
have bombs.
and campaign, even if you disagree with the government, right? Even if you
don't have
disagree
the
with the
bomb,
government.
How you fight?
But
How
it
you
also
have the bomb?
follows that if some people protest at a particular moment with a particular demand, seeking a particular objective, you can also stand up and say, I oppose that protest on that demand on this issue now.
Why?
I oppose it.
Why?
Because what it's about is not what it appears to be about.
Oh, no, that's ridiculous.
That's what my
they're
argument
asking
is.
For
Why
is
are
rather
you
than having candidates that are vetted by China in an election, they have free and fair elections. It's the same argument with trade unions. There are no free and fair trade unions in China or in Hong Kong. I mean, it's just ridiculous to stand there and prevaricate on the question.
Well, in case you didn't notice, only 2 weeks ago, on the 18th of September, there was a vote in Scotland about independence. And just before that vote came up for decision, all the powers that be in Britain were mobilised. The government, the opposition, the Liberal Democrats, the United Kingdom Independence Party, and then just to add their weight, big business was dragged in by the hair and they swore the economy will collapse, the society will be a disaster. And that was the basis on which they manipulated the results of the election. Second, you talk about free and fair elections and
That's what
democracy.
happens in elections.
Now,
People
in
put their
Britain,
case. People
we have a
put their supporters to
we have a
the fore.
particular
And
type
then
of
they have a
democracy.
free
One
and
sec,
fair
one sec.
vote.
Just one sec. In Britain, we have a particular type of democracy. You can have a case, for example, in Britain, we've had it in the 1970s, where the votes which go to the party which gets the most votes doesn't win the election. That happens in Britain because we have constituencies in Britain which have been gerrymandered by the Conservative Party over decades to ensure the Conservative Party gets the maximum votes.
Yeah, and there was a vote
So-
on whether we should
so-
adopt a different election system, a free and fair vote on whether
Now,
we should
now,
adopt
now,
proportional
now,
representation. And
now,
the answer was no.
even when
We
we
don't want
vote,
it.
even when we vote for the government in Britain in a parliamentary election, what happens immediately the election takes place? What happens in order to empower the government? What happens? What's the constitutional necessity that happens? They have to go to the Queen, right? And the Queen has to give her assent to the government.
Has she ever
right?
refused?
She has refused in Australia.
Has she ever refused?
In Australia, the Gough Whitlam government was elected in Australia, and the Queen's representative in Australia abolished the government, and they had to call a new election. So it has happened. The question is now, secondly, we also have in Britain the House of Lords. Are they elected? No. Are they elected body? No, they're not elected. Yet they have legislative powers in Britain. Legislative powers. Now, it's true. I support democracy. In other words, the abolition of the House of Lords, the abolition of the monarchy. I support democracy in China and in Hong Kong. But my concept of democracy is not the same concept as the BBC's. My concept of democracy...
It has an oversight role.
That's what the Chinese government is saying.
It criticises, and in the end, the House of Commons, which everyone
Right,
agrees
okay.
is elected,
Okay,
say,
you want to
If
become...
you want,
Let's
if you want
imagine...
democracy in
Let's
China, you want
imagine-
democracy
so
here.
you're now straying into
Let's imagine
sophism.
you
You're
want to
telling these
become
people things, quickly passing
a
on,
member of
things that are
Parliament.
true.
Let's
The
imagine
House of
you want
Lords
to
is
become... One
elected.
second. Let's imagine you want to become a member of Parliament for the Conservative Party in Britain. What do you do? What do you do? How do you get to be an elected representative in Britain?
Get Bob
You
to
think-
so on rich.
You go into... One is you enter the Conservative Party, step one. Two is you do everything right as far as the leadership of the party is concerned. Step two. Three is the leadership select you to be a candidate, right? First they put you up in a rotten ward where you're going to lose. Then you put you up in a place where they think you're going to win. So in other words, a selection procedure internal to the Conservative Party, external to the democratic will of the population, even to the will of Conservative voters, decides what candidates stand in election. Now in Beijing, they have basically made a deal with the British that in Hong Kong, a committee will decide who can stand in election. I don't agree with it. But that's the deal they made with the British. Now, the actual movement in Hong Kong, they have legitimate demands. I don't dispute that. There are legitimate demands about democracy in Hong Kong. But the movement itself, as I said, like the Conservative Party, like the Labour Party. The Labour Party doesn't elect. They used to allow...
When the British did the deal, it was based on there being a fair representation of the whole society on the committee.
Well, that's not been decided yet.
Over the last 10 years, the Chinese have ensured that all the people on that committee are Chinese yes men. I mean,
That's what the Conservatives
ridiculous to talk about the British. And it's equally
I am
ridiculous
merely
to compare
saying...
the British system, which with all its faults and foibles, which I agree with you on many of them, to compare that with China.
Well,
the two are incomparable.
by making that
Absolutely
comparison...
incomparable. How dare you make such a comparison?
By making that comparison, you get an understanding about how the so-called word democracy is not a universal norm that everyone accepts what it represents. In Britain, we have a particular type of democracy, which basically means that we have a couple of political parties, or three political parties, dominated by the interests of either a big business or partly big business and the trade unions, who have been able to manipulate the population to vote in favour of these parties one time after another. And the electoral system multiplies that strength of that system. If you had a proportional representation system, which I'm not in favour of, but it's an example, if you had a proportional representation system, you would more likely, like in Germany or in France, you'd more likely to have greater representation of minority political views and greater fluidity. But in Britain, you don't. That structure has been incarnated in historical circumstances. That is what gave rise to this. Now, if there were protests against that particular structure in Britain, I'd say good, depending on who is protesting and for what reason.
Yeah, about the referendum we had about Scottish independence. A very good friend of mine, Scottish, said he was going to vote against it, but then he changed his mind. Now the thing is, he was very concerned about the very high turnout. He was appalled at the very high turnout to vote. We have had a referendum before about devolution for power in Scotland, and the turnout was very low, and I don't think what the Scots were being offered last week or the week before was any better, but we had well over 90% turnout. This chap thinks the whole thing had been gerrymandered. They had forged the...
If that was so, Alex Salmon would have said something.
What, sorry?
I said if that was so, Alex Salmon would have said something.
The establishment became very scared that they were about to lose the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is a global brand name. That's the point. It's a global brand name. It allows you to send a diplomat in, and then alongside the diplomat, you have the threat of American bombs and British bombs dropping down on you. So it's a powerful brand name, global brand name with long historical traditions. That's why wherever we talk about Iraq or Syria or the United States or Australia or Hong Kong, you name it, in all those countries, the historical brand name of Britain is integrated with the historical background to that country. That's a fact. That's the British Empire. It's the legacy of the British Empire. So if the heart of the British Empire were to collapse and Scotland vote independence, then of course brand name Britain goes down the toilet. That was the danger. And that's why the British establishment mobilised all the forces they could, dragged every single demon out of the cupboard and said, this is what you're going to get, in order to get the Scots to vote against independence. Once they had that, then what they did was David Cameron declared, England will become independent of Scotland, and Scotland will become a dependent country dominated by England. That's what he said when he said English votes for English laws. It means England, because it controls the majority of the budget, the English Parliament will decide what the budget of the Scottish Parliament is, because we'll control the supply of resources to the rest of Britain. In that way, devolution will be undermined, although it may result ultimately in a new referendum in Scotland in 10 years' time, in which the Scots vote overwhelmingly in favour. The problem is, England by that time will have screwed them so hard as to restrict what they will actually get out of it. That was the game. And there will be no vote on English independence. It will be declared by England without a vote. That's what David Cameron did on the Friday morning. That was his speech immediately after the referendum result. He said, English votes for England. That's it. That's what he said. So in other words, Scotland is out. So here you have the reality. The actual vote took place in Scotland, but in England without a vote, we decide what happens to that country now. That's the truth. So
do you think they have gerrymandered the votes?
I don't think they gerrymandered the vote. They manipulated public opinion, utilising every single political force and economic force that they could. It shows you the way in which the establishment, when it fears for its position of wealth and power and prestige, how they will all unite together to attack any political movement that challenges that. That's the real balance of force in society. And then they said the Queen was independent. But then David Cameron revealed she was purring like a cat when she heard the news. In other words, she was directly in favour of opposing the independence of the Scots. That's what it actually meant.